as well. I worked briefly in International House in London in the 1980s, and it was all a bit scary actually. It wasn't quite as friendly as it appeared to be. I made not too many friends, but there were a few people who greeted me and looked after me. One, of course, was John, the other was Brita, but there was a third person who I remember with great affection. We're now going back 30 more years, and that's Martin Parrott, who looked after me in the staff room and was very, very kind to me. So Martin is going to do our next talk. Martin worked for International House from 1976 till 1999 in a variety of roles, with it not being too specific here. He's currently a freelance writer and teacher trainer and consultant. And he's the author of Tasks for Language Teachers and Grammar. Please go out and buy it from all good bookshops. Martin.
Thank you very much. And as somebody has already said, nobody ever leaves International House. I've always thought of myself as belonging to International House, and I do belong, and I still work for International House, and will be doing so next week. When I was asked if can I just check? Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. If you can't, or if I'm too loud, kind of wave or something. When I was asked if I would take part in today's event, I said yes right away, without really knowing what was involved. And then I looked to see what was involved, and it was to be anecdotal. So I thought about what I would talk about, and then later there was some real thinking went on in International House, and somebody got back to me and said, well, it can be anecdotal, but it has to be professional as well. So you will never find out why I was wearing John Haycraft's underpants, although Brita may remember why, in Tbilisi, or why I was wearing the most extraordinary pair of underpants which existed in the then Soviet Union. So the stories I could tell you have disappeared because I'm going to be professional. And I'm going to pick out 5 examples of things I learned from John. Now, this is very sincere. I put into practice things in my working life and in my non-working life, and I'm sure this is true of everybody. And I remember where I got it from. So I do something, and then often actually, my mother, who died 35 years ago, I hear her voice kind of. But I often do things, and I think, yeah, that was John that I got that from. And I'm just going to talk about 5 things that I've learnt from my experience of working with John. I'm going to begin, this is lesson, let's see if I can make this work. Yes, lesson 1. I don't really, in a way, I never belonged in International House. I've never done an International House course. And in 1976, the long, hot summer of 1976, I had already been teaching for over a year. I began teaching English as a foreign language in the best way that you can begin, which is with no training whatsoever. And then I did some training. I did what is now the Delta. And I wanted to work in Rome or in Paris. And I saw an advertisement, and I came along to 40 Shaftesbury Avenue for an interview for a job in Rome and Paris. And they seemed to like me, and they said, but you will need to do this 4-week course. And then they told me how much it cost. And there was no way I could do it, and I argued about this a bit. And the upshot was that they said, well, come to London, work in London during the summer, and if we like you, and you like us, then maybe you can work for us. And I did that. I came to London in that very long, hot summer, the hottest summer we've ever had, 1976. I worked in 40 Shaftesbury Avenue in tiny rooms with no air conditioning, with windows you couldn't open because of the traffic outside. And my goal was I would then go to Italy or to Rome and be a teacher there. Well, I'd been in International House London for a few weeks, and I was asked to go to John's office. Now, I have to say that John, as other people have said, John was around. John was not a stranger. John was there in the school, introducing himself to people, talking to people, and I talked to John. But I was asked to go to John's office, and he said, after a minute or two, this Rome, Paris thing, you don't want to go there. You want to go to, as John called it, Rabat. I didn't know where Rabat, which is Rabat, for most people, I didn't know where it was. But I kept very quiet about that, and I knew I didn't want to go. But he was very honest. He told me things about the job. He said, you know, it's a... well, I'll tell you some things about the job. It was Director of Studies in a school where the owner didn't speak English and didn't know anything about teaching English. It was a school which hadn't had a Director of Studies for some time and had lost most of its teachers and nearly all of its students. And there were no flights there. And I probably said no, but I can't remember. I certainly didn't say yes. And then I was called back the following day. And in no time at all, the spirit of adventure had infected me. And it's one of the many kind of very naive and foolhardy things I've done in my life, all of which have turned out well. But off I went with my 15 kilos of luggage to Morocco, which is where Rabat is, to do this kind of awful job. Which, of course, I loved. I mean, I didn't love everything about it. I loved nearly everything about it. And I learnt so much, and I thanked John so often for not just having encouraged me to do this, but having given me the confidence to do something I didn't believe I could do. Now, this was John. John was brilliant at getting people to do things they didn't think they can do. There are people who are very confident. John was one. There are people who kind of think they can do anything. I've never been like that. I'm not a confident person. John gave me that push. And one of the things that I have done as a manager, but also as a teacher, is I have tried to get people to do things that they don't really feel that they can do. And then I've enjoyed seeing them get the measure of it and do it well. And that's because John did it to me. And often, I think, when somebody says to me, for example, you know, thank you for encouraging me to do that, I think, that's John. So lesson 1, encourage people to take advantage of opportunities they feel they are not ready for. Lesson 2. I was used to teaching classes for 15 hours a week. I taught, before I came to International House, I had a class in the morning, 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon. International House was confusing. It wasn't like that. I had a class for an hour, then another class for an hour in the afternoon, then I had a class for 2 hours in the afternoon, and then I worked some evenings. And it didn't go terribly well. And I had one class in particular where I felt the students were unhappy, and I lost sleep about this. I worried about it, and I tried everything I could, and I knew it wasn't going well. I'm sure I spoke to my Director of Studies, who I'm sure helped me, but it was John in the bar, because we had a bar in International House in those days. It was John in the bar who came up to me one evening and said, "How's it going?" John never asked anybody anything without wanting to know the answer. And John was interested in people. And John said, "How is it going?" And I told him that it was going really badly. And John said, "Well, obvious what you should do. Take them to the pub." Now, I knew that the problem was me. that it was, I hadn't worked out how I should do it properly, and take them to the pub was ridiculous. So I kind of said, yes, John, you're fine. And then went home and lost another night's sleep worrying about my class. And then the next day, John said, well, how did it go at the pub? And I said, well, actually, I haven't taken them to the pub yet. Well, take them to the pub. Take them tonight, he said. So I took my students to the pub. I kind of suggested we go to the pub. Stupid idea. It was not where the problem was. It wasn't going to help anything. It was going to make things worse. I took them to the pub. It was one of those classes, and I still have them, classes which I feel nervous about going into. You kind of dread the lesson and the beginning of the lesson. I went in, and it was different. The students seemed to be getting on with each other better. They were more responsive to me, and at the end of the lesson, I bumped into John. Actually, at the end of the lesson, I went to the bar. So I bumped into John, and John said, so did you take them to the pub? And I said, yes. And he said, well, how was the lesson? Well, actually, John, it's the first lesson I've had where things went quite well. And after that, things went better. Now, the lesson I learned from John is not take your students to the pub. And for the last 15 years, I've been teaching 11 to 18-year-olds, so it wouldn't really be the solution to many problems. But accept help and try unlikely measures to solve problems. If John hadn't been so insistent, I would have just listened to his advice and then ignored it. But he made me take advice that I thought was bad advice, and it was good advice. And what I have learnt from this, and I try to remind myself of this when I get stuck, is ask people for advice and don't discount it. Take it. And I suppose the other thing is my instinct is to think if I've got a problem, it's my responsibility. It's very narcissistic behaviour. I think it's my responsibility and I have to sort it out. John, who wasn't like that at all, had some other solutions. So I think I've learned that it's not necessarily because of me. Thank you again, John. Lesson 3. Oh, now this one is not... My five lessons from John are in no particular order. They're in the order that I thought of them. They're kind of vaguely chronological. Some are more important than others. The first one is very important, the encouraging people to do things they don't think that they can do. Lesson 3 it's terribly useful, and John, I think of you so often because I kind of put on my John Haycraft hat and I do John. Because I worked in a school where the owner didn't speak English and didn't know anything about ELT, one of the great things was that I had experience of being a director as well as a director of studies in many ways, and I attended my first directors' conference in 1977. I was terribly shy. I was 20 years younger than anybody else. I was considerably poorer than anybody else. And I was very, very shy at this event, and I didn't know anybody. And it simply didn't matter, because John's way of dealing with any kind of event was to introduce people to each other. He would kind of go around the room and he got names wrong quite often. So he'd say, Michael, so you must meet, you've got so much to talk about. And then would John spent his time putting people together in social events. And of course, you stand there and say, actually, my name isn't Michael. And you establish the bond and the rapport, and you talk about, how John never remembers anybody's name, but he knows who you are. John was brilliant at making people feel comfortable in social gatherings. And in the 40 years since then, I've often had to host gatherings with lots of people who don't know each other. And I am quite shy. I'm not very good at talking to people. It's brilliant. You just introduce everybody to everybody. You get it wrong, son. You introduce husbands to their wives. but you kind of moved on and you're introducing other people. John, that is a technique. It's like kind of drilling, Jeremy. It's a technique that is brilliant and it doesn't go away. And I suggest everybody who ever has to organise weddings or conferences or whatever, do it. Introduce people to each other. Pretend you know them when you don't and get them talking. Lesson 4, I can't remember. Lesson 4 is related to lesson 1. You know how there are people you work with who are bolshy. You know there are people who are always, Steve, I'm sure you do, perhaps people who just moan all the time, and people who kind of get angry and work. Maureen sitting there thinking, I know who he's talking about, and she's run out of fingers already. The troublemakers, the ones who kind of want to be running things and are always kind of arguing with you, people who take you on in meetings, who argue with you in meetings, those people. What did John do with them? He promoted them. He would say anybody who was a kind of pain in his side, John would promote. And it worked. I mean, sometimes they're uncomfortable in these roles, and so they go off somewhere else. Fine. Very often, the reason they have been a nuisance is because their creativity, their responsibility is frustrated in an organisation, and they respond to this. Now, I think this is kind of reward difficult behaviour with responsibility. It's a useful management ploy. I'm quite sure, Maureen, it's not in any of the books that you mentioned, but then there are other things that we know work that are not in the books. But I did think I'm talking to IH, I ought to talk about new ideas in the classroom. But, nobody of my age, kind of what's new to somebody of my age is not of interest. Yesterday was that fab day of new ideas in the classroom, and I don't know how many of you were online. It was brilliant. No new ideas in the classroom for me, but this is a classroom idea. The difficult students very often are the ones who need responsibility, and particularly if you're teaching young learners, if you're teaching teens, kids who are difficult, give them a role, give them something to do, give them something which gives them attention in a constructive way, and you reduce the problem. So again, John, thank you. Idea 5, it's my last idea. John retired, I think, in 1990. And love John, though we all did, there was a kind of, thank God we can now get on and do our jobs. Because John had so much energy. John's 20-something years older than me, but exhausted me. Even John, rather ill, had lots of energy. So when John retired, we all kind of thought, now we can get on and do what we want and no crazy ideas. And then John turns up, retired. He's met somebody in a bar. Half the International House schools are because John met people in bars. But John had met somebody in a bar who wanted to start dozens of schools. And not only dozens of schools, but he wanted to start dozens of schools in countries nobody had ever heard of. And John, I was at that time responsible for teacher training, not only for the London School, but for the World Organisation. And so all of this was going to land on me. I was going to be the person who kind of had to deal with it. And to my shame, I think many of us kind of thought, oh God, John, no. And we were not as cooperative as we could have been. Now, this crazy idea of John to start schools. They weren't initially affiliated to International House. It was John all over again, was the lifeblood for International House. In the 1990s, there was an injection of life into International House from dynamic, original, creative schools, largely run by people who were not Brits, and that was the great thing, and they were all of them in Eastern Europe, many of them in countries of the former Soviet Union, and they created a huge wave, and an entirely positive wave that went through International House, and many of these schools, all these schools are still there. Many of them are very large, very successful, have huge teacher training departments, are breaking new ground now in working with local teachers and doing things for local teachers, and have created a lot of jobs and opportunities for the team of people in International House. John, I'm sorry I didn't think your idea was very good. It was a crazy idea, but it was a visionary idea, it was a practical idea, it was an idea that worked. And what I confess I haven't really learnt it yet, but I'm still trying to, is to support crazy ideas, not to kind of think, oh God, nobody would ever want to do that. John was a visionary, John had ideas, John made things happen, and I wish I had had more faith. I very quickly became convinced. Now, I wanted to finish with a photograph. I have a photograph somewhere of John Haycraft sitting on my balcony in Rabat in 1977, 1978 perhaps, reading a newspaper with a photograph of John in it. And one of my great achievements in Rabat was getting John there and getting quite a lot of publicity. And so I got John on the front page of Le Matin. There he was. And I looked for the photograph and I couldn't find it, so I can't show this to you. But instead I'm going to show you, I'm going to finish with a photograph I did find. So for any old people who are online thinking, who is this geezer who's talking? Who is that? I was in International House 40 years ago. Who is that? In 1979, Jeff Mohammed took a photograph of every teacher who was then working in International House London, and we were all on a board. So, those of you who are thinking, who is that old geezer with white hair? I'm him. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much for that inspiring talk of all the lessons you've learnt. I'm sure many of us will learn from